partly an introduction to this week's parasha, which is Lech Lecha, which starts with Avraham appearing on the scene and Hashem speaking to Avraham. And I want to ask the question, at what age did Avraham recognize Hashem? At what age did Avraham realize that there was a God in the world? We know that he lived in a world of idolatry. The Midrash tells us that his father was a professional idolater who made and served idols. We know the story of Avraham smashing the idols. Avraham at some stage realized that the idolatry into which he'd been born and which was all around him was false, and there was one God to whom we should worship. When did he realize that? How old was he? Now, there's a well-known answer. Most people would answer, based on one of the sources we're going to see, that he was 3 years old. And indeed, the Midrash brings that as one of two options for how old he was. So if we look at quote number 1, we have a pasuk from Parshat Toldot, as it happens, where Hashem blesses Yitzchak. And he blesses Yitzchak, and Hashem says, I'm blessing you in the merit of your father Avraham, because Avraham followed my mitzvot. And the pasuk says, Ekev, which here means because, Asher Shama Avraham B'koli, Avraham listened to my voice, Vayishmor Mishmarati, and he guarded what needs to be guarded, mitzvatai, my mitzvot, chukotai, my statutes, v'toratai, and my Torah, or my teaching. Avraham did all those things. And the word Ekev is particularly interesting. It's not the normal word we would expect here, and perhaps that's why the Midrash darshans on the word, and it says like this. If you look in quote number 2, the Bereshit Rabbah starts with our pasuk, Ekev Asher Shema Avraham B'koli, and then it says, Rabbi Yochanan, Rabbi Chanina, Taravaihun, perhaps we can close the door? Maybe, all right. Rabbi Yochanan uva Rabbi Chanina Taravaihun Amri, Ben Arba'im V'Shmona Shana, Hakia Avraham et Baro. Rabbi Yochanan and Rabbi Chanina, both of them say that Avraham was 48 years old when he recognized Hashem. We'll come back to that and we'll ask what's the significance of 48? But Rabbi Yochanan and Rabbi Chanina don't say he was 3 years old, they say he was 48 years old. Then, in the third line of number 2, Reish Lakish Omar, Ben Shalosh Shanim Hikir Avraham et Baro. He was 3 years old when he recognized his creator. Minyan Ekev, Ayin Kuf Vet, the number of Ekev, which in Gematria is 172, Shema Avraham B'koli, Avraham listened to my voice, B'kol Baro, Avraham listened to the voice of his creator. In other words, Reish Lakish looks at that pasuk and says, it doesn't mean Ekev, Shema B'koli, because Avraham listened to my voice. In addition, it means something else. Ekev, 172, because that's the gematria of Ekev, Avraham listened to my voice. What's the significance of 172? How old was Avraham when he died? 175. So if he was 175 when he died, and he listened to Hashem's voice for 172 years, that means he discovered Hashem when he was 3. And that is the second opinion in the Midrash. So the first opinion is that he was 48, and we don't have at the moment a reason for the significance of that number. The second opinion is that he was 3, which is the traditional view. Now, one of the things I want to explore is what's the difference between appreciating the God at the age of 3 and appreciating God at the age of 48. And we'll come back to that question. But in the meantime, the Midrash gives both possibilities. Now I want to go to the Rambam. So the Rambam writes the Mishnah Torah. And the Mishnah Torah is a book of laws. It is not a book of stories. However, there are a few occasions when the Rambam waxes lyrically and tells a story. And the beginning of Hilchot Avodah Zarah is one of those occasions. Hilchot Avodah Zarah, the laws of idolatry. And the Rambam tells us how it came to be that the world was full of idolatry. After all, Adam HaRishon knew who Hashem was. Noach knew who Hashem was. 10 generations later, Avraham is in a world of idolatry. What went wrong? And the Rambam explains that people started davening to Hashem, and then they looked up in the sky, and they saw the stars and the planets which Hashem had made. And they began to think that these stars and planets are servants of Hashem. And then they began to think that rather than davening to the big boss, I'll daven to one of the servants, and the servants will, as it were, pass on my message. Instead of seeing the CEO, I'll see the secretary, and the secretary will forward my complaint or my request to the CEO. So everything's okay. People still know there's a God in the world, and they're only davening to the stars and the planets in order that their messages be passed on to Hashem. But then, in the course of time, people began to think that the stars and the planets were independent deities, independent gods, and people started to daven to the stars and the planets and not to Hashem himself. That, in a nutshell, is how the Rambam describes the beginnings of idolatry in the world. And then he goes on to say that something happened to break out of this situation. If you look at number 3, he continues the story and he says about Avraham. Kevon shenigmal eiten zeh. When this giant, this spiritual giant, Nigmal, was weaned. Now, weaning didn't happen, I think weaning happened a lot later in olden times than it does today. And we'll come back to the significance of that later. But when this giant, Avraham, was weaned, hitchil l'shotet b'dato. He began to wander, wander, in his mind. V'hu katan, and he was young. V'hitchil lachshov b'yom u'b'layla. And he began to think by day and by night. V'hu haya tameh, and he was wondering, he was surprised. Hech efsha sheyeh hagalgal hazeh noheg tamid. How is it possible that this planet, our planet Earth, keeps going round and round constantly? V'lo yeh lo manhig, and it doesn't have a person making it go round. Umi yisovev oto, who is making it rotate? Ki efsha sheyisovev atzmo, because it's impossible that it's rotating itself. There must be some other power that is causing the Earth to go round and round. V'lo haya lo malamed, and he didn't have a teacher. V'lo modia, he didn't have somebody to influence him, to modia davar, to inform him of things. Ela mushka ba'or kastim, he was immersed in the place called Ur Kasdim and its idolatrous culture. Bein ovdei kochavim hatipshim, amongst these foolish idolaters. Va'aviv v'imo v'chol ha'am ovdei kochavim, and his father and his mother and all the people were worshippers of idols, literally stars. V'hu oved imahem, and he worshipped with them. As we say in the Haggadah, mitchila ovdei avodah zarah hayu avotenu, originally our ancestors were idolaters. It's a debate when we learn the Haggadah. There's a question whether Avraham is included in that as well. Says the Rambam, he was included. He was serving idols with the rest of them. But, end of line 4, v'lebi shotet, his mind was wandering. Again, the Rambam uses the word shotet, which occurs in the Tanakh, and it means to be restless, to wander. And eventually, umevin, and he understood, end of line 4, ad shehisig derech emet, until he reached the way of truth. Vehevin kalvat tzedek, mitvunoto hanachona, and he reached the right answer from his correct understanding. V'yoda sheyesham eloka echad, and he knew that there was one God. V'hu manhig hagalgal, and he was the one who makes the planet go round and round. By the way, I feel just in the interest of intellectual honesty, I should point out that this is based on a medieval understanding of physics, that something will only rotate if something's making it rotate. And Newtonian mechanics, from the 17th century onwards, has helped us understand that that's not correct. If you start something to rotate, it will carry on rotating by itself until there is an alternative force that slows it down. However, we can understand this idea metaphorically, or we can understand it according to the science of the time. The Rambam says that the Avraham worked out there must be a force making the world go round, even though today's science would learn differently. So Avraham reached the conclusion that there was a power, a God, one God, that rotates the earth, v'hu bara hakol, and that God created everything. V'ein b'kol nimsa eloka chutz mimenu, and there's nothing except him. By the way, we've got a few of the principles of faith, which the Rambam says we all must believe as a mitzvah. But there is a God, but there's only one God, and there's no other God but him. V'yeda shekol ha'olam to'im, And Avraham knew that the whole world was making a mistake. And the thing that was making them make this mistake, that they were worshipping stars and they were worshipping images, statues and drawings of the stars, until the truth was completely lost from them. So that's the intellectual, scientific, pseudo-philosophical process that Avraham went through. And at what stage did he finish this process? Number 4. Uben arba'im shana hikir Avraham et baro. Avraham was 40 years old when he recognized his creator. Kevon shehikir v'yada, once he did recognize and he knew, hitchil la'ashiv teshuvot al bnei or kasdim. He began to give answers to the people around him in Ur Kasdim and to tell them the truth. Ula'arech din imahem, and to have arguments with them about the nature of God. V'lomar she'ein zu derech ha'emet, and to tell them that the path on which they were traveling is not the way of truth. She'atem holchim ba, the way they're going on. V'shiber hatzalamim, and he broke the idols. It's interesting that the Rambam quotes what we know as a midrash to help to explain the development of Avraham, because the breaking of the idols was his response to the idolatry around him and his technique for awakening people to the real nature of God. And he began to make known to the people around him that it's not fitting to serve anyone except Hashem. And to Hashem, it is appropriate to bow down and to offer sacrifices. Okay, so we've had a description there in the Rambam of how Avraham came to the conclusion that he did, but we're told at the beginning of paragraph 4, explicitly, Avraham was not 3 when he recognized Hashem, but he was 40. Why 40? Where does the Rambam get the idea of 40 from? Now, so far, if you've been keeping track, we've got 3 different numbers, and we're going to have a 4th by the end. Was he 3? Was he 48, which is the other view in the Midrash? Or was he 40, which is the Rambam's view? Now, we might find later the significance of 40, but straight away I want to refer to the Kesef Mishnah in number 5. So the Kesef Mishnah is a commentary on the Rambam. It's written by Rabbi Yosef Cairo, who's also perhaps better known as writing the Shulchan Aruch. And the Kesef Mishnah, one of the things that he tries to do is to try to find the sources for the Rambam's words. The Rambam in the Mishnah Torah famously didn't give references. There are no footnotes. The Rambam derives his halacha that he presents in the Mishnah Torah from the Gemara, but he doesn't say where he got it in the Gemara. And that was one of the reasons why his book was quite controversial at first. One of the things the Kesef Mishnah does in his commentary, and others do as well, as we will see, is to provide sources for what the Rambam said. So in number 5, the Kesef Mishnah says, Tzorich lomar shahaya gores, you need to say that the Rambam had a different text of the Midrash that we quoted in number 2. That his version read as follows: Rabbi Yochanan, Rabbi Chanina, da'amri tavaihu ben arba'im shana hikir Avraham et baro. That his version of our Midrash had not 3 and 48 as the 2 options, but 3 and 40. His text said 40. V'lo ben memchet, and not 48. Kamoshahu b'svarim, as we find in our books. In other words, if you look at the Midrash Rabbah, it will say 48. But we suppose that the Rambam had a different version of the same text, and his version said 40. So that also explains the source of the Rambam's number. I'm now going to say 48/40. Between the 2 variants that the Kesef Mishnah tells us there were, one variant says 40, one variant says 48. They're essentially the same. Rambam in his Midrash had 40, and that's why he says Avraham was 40 years old. But now let's see the Raavad. Now, the Raavad, Rabbi Avraham ben David, was a contemporary of the Rambam, and he commented on the Mishnah Torah in very short, pithy comments, and they almost always are very disagreeing, very antagonistic towards the words of the Rambam. It's interesting that if you open the page of the Rambam, you get the Rambam in the middle, you get the commentaries on one side and on the other side, but the commentary of the Raavad, because it's so sort of integral to learning the Rambam, is right inside the text of the Rambam itself. And the Raavad makes these short comments. Sometimes he says the Rambam's got it completely wrong in terms of his understanding of the halakha. Sometimes he says the Rambam's right, but he didn't even need to bother to say it. It's that sort of critical commentary. And here he says the following in number 6. So quoting the words of the Rambam, where he says, Uben arba'im shana hikir Avraham et baro. Avraham was 40 years old when he recognized his creator. The next line begins Aleph Aleph, which stands for Omar Avraham, which is the way the Raavad introduces his comments. Yesh agada ben shalosh shanim. Says the Raavad, there is a story or a narrative that he was 3. The Rambam says 40. The Raavad says, but there is a story that he was 3. There is a narrative in our sources, we'll talk about what the sources are in a minute, that he was 3. Now, what is the basis of this question? How is it an attack on the Rambam? We have seen that the Rambam's got a very fine source for his position. The Bereshis Rabbah, number 2 on our page, said Avraham was 3, or Avraham was 48, which in the Rambam's view meant 40. The Rambam's version says 40. So the Rambam says, I've picked the number 40, I take it from the Midrash, I build the story around it, I say Avraham was 40. What's wrong with that? The answer of what's wrong with that is as follows. Let's look at number 7. Number 7 is the Gemara, the Talmud Bavli, in the Darim, where we find the following. V'amar Rav Ami bar Abba, ben gimel shanim hikir Avraham et baro. Rav Ami bar Abba says Avraham was 3. How do I know that? Shneimar, ekev asher shema Avraham b'koli, because Avraham listened to my voice, chushbanei, and the number, the summation of the letters of ekev, ayin kuf vet, is mea v'shivin v'tarin, 172. Same idea we saw above. So in the Gemara, it says, Avraham heard Hashem's voice for 172 years, which means Avraham discovered Hashem when he was 3, and that's it. Our Gemara doesn't say anything about 40 or 48. So the classical sources are as follows. The Midrash that we saw in number 2 says 3 or 48. The Gemara says 3. Now, although it's not absolutely clear what the Raavad's question is, it is commonly understood as follows: that we have sources in the Rambam, in the Midrash, we have sources in the Gemara, and the Gemara trumps. That's not a deliberate use of the word today. The Gemara trumps the Midrash. In other words, it is wrong to leave the Gemara and go to the Midrash, because the Gemara is the ultimate source. The Midrash is a source, but you cannot deny what's in the Gemara. So what the Raavad is saying to the Rambam is, it's very nice that you've come up with this idea that Avraham was 40, but Yesh Agada, there is a story, which means the only story that you will find in our Gemara is that he was 3. So the implied question is, how can the Rambam ignore the Gemara and choose to go with the Midrash? That is the question of the Raavad. And indeed, it's not just one place in the Gemara, it's implied somewhere else that he was very young when he discovered Hashem. If you look at number 8, a different Gemara from Megillah, talking about who Avraham was and who Avram was, because they're 2 names for the same person, Avraham, who Avraham, and then it says, Hu b'tzidko mitchilato v'ad sofo. He was righteous from his beginning to his end. Says the Gemara, Avraham was righteous for all his life, from his beginning. We're not quite sure what the beginning is, but certainly from a very early age. And commenting on this, in number 9, is the Maharsha. So the Maharsha comments on, a lot of different things, but he has a special section called Chidushe Agadot, where he comments on the narrative sections of the Gemara. And regarding this Gemara we just learnt, in number 8, where it says, Avraham was righteous from beginning to end, says the Maharsha in number 9, Kemo shekatuv ben gimel shanim hikir Avraham et baro. Just like the idea that Avraham recognized Hashem when he was 3. So when the Gemara in number 8 in Megillah says he was righteous from beginning to end, doesn't mean from his first breath, because we don't expect a baby to recognize Hashem, but he recognized Hashem at a young age. Where do we have a source that he recognized Hashem at a young age? Well, we have it in the Gemara that he recognized Hashem when he was 3. So we see actually, to support the Raivod's attack on the Rambam, not only is there one Gemara that says he discovered Hashem when he was 3 explicitly, there's another Gemara that says he was very young when he discovered Hashem. So again, we turn the question back on the Rambam. How can the Rambam ignore the Gemara that says he was 3 and go with the Midrash that says he was 48, or in the Rambam's case, 40? Now, one of the commentators on the Rambam is called the Migdal Oz. And the style of the Migdal Oz is to always defend the Rambam against the Raavad. So if the Raavad asks a question, one of the places we would look to see how we could answer the question on behalf of the Rambam is to look at the Migdal Oz. And the Migdal Oz in number 10 says, so the first words are just a sort of reference point to where the Rambam began. Bimei enosh v'chulei ad ben arbim shana hikia Avraham et baro. Commenting on this section of the Rambam that we learnt in number 3, says the Migdal Oz, end of line 1 of number 10, Kulo kabeitz b'da'ato hanachona. This is all what the Rambam, collected in his mind, his correct mind, Mishah hasfarim umin haramoz b'talmud, from other books and what's alluded to in the Talmud. So the Migdal Oz says, you know what? The number 40 or 48 doesn't appear in the Talmud, but it appears in other books, like the Midrash, and it's alluded to in the Talmud. Now, I don't know, and I don't think anyone knows for sure, what the Migdal Oz means by it's alluded to in the Talmud, but the Migdal Oz is conceding that there's no explicit reference in the Talmud that Avraham was an adult of 40 or 48. But nevertheless, says the Migdal Oz, it's alluded to in the Talmud, and the Rambam, whose mind is correct, he got it from other sources. And when the Migdal Oz says in the third line, Kotav harayvad, yesh agada ben shalosh shanim, there is a story that he was 3 years old. Minyan Akev, the gematria of the word Akev is 172, and that's the end of what the Raavad says. And we've explained that the Raavad is asking the Rambam why he dropped the idea of 3, which we find in the Gemara, and used the idea of 40, which we only find outside the Gemara. So says the Migdal Oz in line 4, V'ani omer ha'emet ki shteihen nimtzaot ot ba'ot. I say the truth, that the two ideas, 3 or 40, they're both found letter by letter. For Rambam Zal, Katav Kan Hakrova. And here he put literally the nearest, in other words, the one that makes the most sense. So the Migdal Oz says, but the Rambam says, 3 doesn't make so much sense. Doesn't make sense that a little child would have this awareness of God. It makes much more sense that he was an adult. And since we find support for both of them, as it happens not in the Gemara, but in the Midrash, the Rambam says, I chose the one that's available in the Midrash that is Korova, is the most likely explanation. If we turn over the page, we come to other ways to support the idea that he was 40. So far, let's just recap where we're up to. Midrash says 3 or 48. The Rambam says 40. The Gemara says 3. The Kesef Mishnah explained that the Rambam is quoting the Midrash that it was 48, but his version said 40. And the Raavad asked why the Rambam ignored what it says in the Gemara that says he was 3. So I want to explore the number 40 and then explore the number 48 before we bring all this together.
How's the Migdal Oz in this?
How? Sorry?
How's the Migdal Oz?
So he's defending the Rambam, and he says the Rambam sees 2 approaches in front of him. They're both there in the Midrash, and he chooses the one which is more logical. And that's why he says 40, and that's why he doesn't say 3. Now, he hasn't, the way I phrased the Raavad's question is he hasn't really answered it. The way I phrased the Raavad's question was, how can the Rambam ignore the Gemara, which just says 3 and nothing else, and go for the Midrash that has the alternative? But the Migdal Oz says, I'm paraphrasing slightly, and I hope I'm being fair, that it makes so much more sense that he was an adult that that's the one we'll go for.
You can't do that.
Why not?
Well, you can't say, here's TORAH. Well, it doesn't make sense.
Okay, so the way I understand it, and we'll come up with a better answer before we finish. Okay, so we can look forward to that. But the way I understand it is the Ravid's position is the only source that you can really rely on is the Gemara. But the Migdal Oz is happy with the Rambam might have used other sources like the Midrash. It's not that the Rambam made it up from nothing, it's the Rambam adopted the Midrash rather than adopting the Gemara. Okay, let's get back to what might be the significance of 40. So in Pirkei Avot, there is a list of ages where different things happen. At 5, you start learning Chumash. At 10, you start learning Mishnah. You get married. You get various character traits as you go along. And amongst them is this, in number 11, Ben Arba'im LeBina. After the age of 40, you get Bina, understanding. So the basic idea is before you're 40, you don't really have a full understanding, a logical, intellectual approach to understanding the world. After 40, you do. And we find in the Chumash an interesting reference to this. In number 12, at the end of Moshe Rabbeinu's life, when he's giving his final farewell to the Bnei Israel, he talks about what Hashem gave them, what Hashem didn't give them. He talked about Hashem gave them the Torah. But he says in number 12, V'lo natam Hashem lachem leiv ladat ve'enayim lirot. Hashem has not given you a heart to know and eyes to see, ve'aznayim lishmoa, and ears to hear, ad hayom hazeh, until this day. Now, when is this day? This is very close to Moshe's last day. The Bnei Israel have been in the Midbar for 40 years. They got the Torah 40 years earlier. But Moshe is saying, today is a special day. Only today have you got the ability to understand it. And Rashi says in number 13, V'lo natan Hashem lachem leiv ladat. Hashem has not given you a heart to know. What does that mean? She'ein adam omed al sof da'ato shel rabo. A person does not literally reach the end of the knowledge of their teacher. I would rephrase that as a person does not fully understand what they've learned from their teacher. V'chachmat mishnato, and the wisdom of their learning, ad arba'im shana, until 40 years. Leficha, and therefore, lo hikpid aleichem hamakom ad hayom hazeh. Hashem has not been, literally in Hebrew, makpid, Hashem has not been particular with you until today. Aval mikan ve'elach yakpid. But from now on, he will be particular. Now, I don't want to get too much into the last bit. I brought it because it's here on the page. But the implication is, before you were able to fully understand the Torah, you couldn't be held liable for not doing it properly. But now, 40 years have passed, now you have a full understanding of the Torah, so now Hashem will pick you up if you transgress. But the key idea I want to say is that Rashi is saying that it takes 40 years to reach an understanding. And maybe that dovetails with the Rambam's idea that only at the age of 40 did Avraham reach the understanding of his tremendous discovery of the existence and the nature of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. And that also fits what we saw in the Pirkei Avot, in number 11, that Ben Arba'im Labina, that at the age of 40, one is gifted a special level of understanding that one didn't have before. But, so that's a couple of ideas about the number 40. Let's get back to the number 48. Now, just to recall, our Midrash gave two options, 48 or 3. The Rambam said 40. The Kesef Mishnah said that's because his text said 40, it didn't say 48. But let's look at the number 48. What might be significant about Avraham when he was 48 years old? Now, I don't know. But there is an interesting observation made in another Midrash that goes like this. We want to ask, how old was Avraham when his ancestor Peleg died? Now, at the end of last week's parsha, end of Parshas Noach, we have the genealogy from Noach through his son Shem, all the way down to Nachor, Avraham's grandfather, Terach, Avraham's father, and down to Avraham. And how old they were when they begat the next generation, and how many years they lived after that time. So if we go back to the generation of Peleg, Peleg was the son of Ever, as in the yeshiva of Shem and Ever. So that makes Shem Abraham's Noah's son. I think we go down 3 generations to get to Ever, and then another generation to get to Peleg. And Peleg, it says here in number 14 in Rashi, it's a bit of arithmetic to go through. Peleg mate b'shana memchet la'Avraham. When Peleg died, Avraham was 48. That's interesting, because the Midrash said he discovered God when he was 48. Maybe there's a connection. Let's just go through the arithmetic. Ketzad, how do we know this? Peleg chai acharei holidu et Reu reish tet shana. So Peleg had a son called Reu, and who's going to be an ancestor of Avraham. And after Reu was born, Peleg lived for another 209 years, and then he died. So remember that. Tzemahem lamed bet kashonolag sarug. So let's look at the time from Reu to be born until Avraham was born. So Reu was 32 years old when his son Sarug was born. Misharug ad shonolad Nachor lamed. And when Sarug had his son, who was called Nachor, Sarug was 30 years old. So from the time Reu was born, we've gone 32 years of Reu, 30 years of Sarug, Hare Samach Bet, that makes 62. Umi Nachor ad shenolad Terach, and Nachor was, when he gave birth, his wife gave birth to Terach, was Kaftet, 29 years old. So from the birth of Reu, we're now Hare Tzadi Aleph, 91 years past. Umisham ad shenolad Avraham, and how old was Terach when Avraham was born? And the answer is 70, ayin. So if you add up all these years so far, Hare Kuf Samach Aleph. So from the birth of Reu, son of Peleg, to the birth of Avraham was 161 years. Tein lechem menchet hare reish tet. So if you add 48 years after the birth of Avraham, you get to 209 years from the birth of Saru, and that's when Peleg died. Which means, and if you're not totally with me, that's okay, just get to this point. Avraham was 48 years old when Peleg died. Now, why is that significant? Because of something else we know about at the time when Peleg died. Why was Peleg called Peleg? Rashi says his father had some sort of nevuah, some sort of prophecy, that in his son's lifetime, the world would be niflaga, divided. There will be a division between all the tribal groups. When was there a division of all the peoples of the world? At the time of Migdal Bavel, building the Tower of Bavel. Hashem's response was to mix up people's languages, and then they all spread out into their different groups. And Rashi also says in last week's parasha that if Peleg was called Peleg because the world was going to be divided, it was going to be at a particular time of his life. Not the beginning, because it didn't happen then, so it must be at the end of his life. And that's what it says in Rashi in number 15. Shaninu b'Seder Olam. We've learnt in the Seder Olam, which is another midrash, shebesof yamav nitpalgu, that at the end of the days, brackets, of Peleg, in other words, when Peleg died, then there was the division of the world. So, if we put all this together, we find something fascinating. Avraham was 48 when Peleg died, which was the year of Migdal Bavel, the year that the Tower of Bavel was built. Maybe this sheds light on our original midrash that said, according to one opinion, that Avraham was 48 when he discovered God. What does this mean? Well, maybe it's like this. See, there are different ways that you can discover God. The Rambam has given a picture of intellectual, scientific analysis. But there's also an idea, very differently, that Avraham looked around at the world and said, the world is corrupt. The world is depraved. The world's in a mess. There must be something better. There must be a way to make this go away and make this corruption, this perversion, better. There is a fascinating midrash, which is for another time, that compares Avraham to a person traveling and seeing a palace in flames. And the traveler looks at the palace in flames and says, there must be somebody in charge of this palace. And the nimshal, the meaning of this midrash, is that Avraham looks at the world in flames and says there must be somebody in charge who is going to put the world to rights. And it turns out that the person is God, and God's way of putting the world to right is to appoint Avraham to do it. But that's for another time. So maybe we see a similar idea here. Why did the people build the Tower of Babel? So again, last week's parasha, Rashi gives three answers. One is because they wanted to fight with Hashem. They wanted to climb the mountain and fight with Hashem. We'll leave out one of the answers. And the other one I want to mention is that the people calculated that every 1656 years there's a flood. And they wanted to, as it were, reinforce the sky to ensure that that wouldn't happen again. Which sounds quite a clever sort of technique in terms of to avoid climate crisis. But actually it means something very different. We know there was a flood because the world deserved it, because the people behaved so badly, but they had to be punished. There's a much better way of avoiding another flood, which is reform yourselves, make yourselves better people. Don't behave like the generation of the flood did. But they chose a different technique to avoid another flood. To reinforce the sky means we can carry on behaving however we want without fear of punishment. So however you cut it, the people building the Migdal Bavel had nefarious intentions. And Avraham, who was 48 at the time, sees this world and says there must be a better way. It's interesting, the Mefarshim give different reasons for why the people built the tower, but actually the Pasuk is quite clear. The Pasuk gives an explicit reason. The people said, we don't want to be scattered on the face of the earth, and we want this tower that we're building, Na'aseh lanu Shem. We will make a name for ourselves. We'll be known as the people who built the Tower of Babel. People will remember us as great builders. Na'aseh lanu Shem. We'll make a name for ourselves. Fast forward to the next chapter in the Chumash, and I mean the next chapter in the narrative, is Avraham. And Avraham arrives in Eretz Israel, and he goes here and there, and he builds altars. And when he builds an altar, the Pasuk says, Vayikra b'shem Hashem. He called out in the name of Hashem. He told people about Hashem. The people building the tower wanted to make a name for themselves. Avraham, who sees this and who's 48 years old, realizes there must be a better way. And instead of making a name for themselves, he sets out to make a name for Hashem. Which brings me to another source, which I felt I didn't have room for on the page. But the Maharsha, whom we met earlier, learns that Avraham was 52 when he discovered God. I'll go through the maths very quickly. The Gemara in Avodah Zarah says there will be 6,000 years of the earth. There'll be 2,000 years of tohu, which means sort of emptiness, when the world's in chaos. 2,000 years of Torah, and 2,000 years of Mashiach. I mean, the Gemara says it looks like we're already into the years of Mashiach, and he hasn't come, and that's our fault because we haven't done teshuvah properly. Then the Gemara asks, when did the 2,000 years of Torah begin? So you might assume the 2,000 years of Torah began at Matan Torah when the Torah was given. But the numbers don't work out. And I won't go into all the numbers there, but the Gemara says that doesn't leave enough time for the 2,000 years of Torah. They must have started earlier. And they say they started, if you calculate, when Avraham was 52. And that's when he started propagating about Hashem. That's when, in the beginning of this week's parasha, we read that he went to Eretz Yisrael with Hanefesh Asher Asu Charan, the souls that they had made in Haran. What does it mean to make souls? So Rashi gives two answers. One is that the word asu here means to buy, and they were the people he had hired to be part of his household. But Rashi also says, alternatively, that the people whom they'd made were the people whom they'd converted. Is not quite the right word because they didn't become Jewish, but they had shared with these people the idea of Hashem, there is one God whom we should serve, and they were the ones who went along with Avraham. And by various bits of calculation, the Maharsha works out that Avraham was 52 at this point, and says that that was the conclusion of his finding Hashem. And I find that fascinating, that according to the Rambam hinted at this, but the Maharsha says explicitly that finding Hashem only really happens when you share your knowledge with someone else. And that applies to anything we learn. We only really understand things if we're able to explain them to somebody else. That's the best way to know if you really understand something. But in terms of knowing about God, it's not enough to know about God. You could argue that maybe there were people like Shem and Ever who knew about God, but they didn't tell others about them. They didn't go out. They didn't do an outreach program like Avraham Avinu did. So a third answer, 4th actually, 40, 48, 52, is the answer. Fourth answer is 52. That's when Avraham not just worked out about God for himself, but shared his knowledge with others. Now, the Maharsha, in that piece which I just quoted, makes another observation, which I'll read in the name of the Kesef Mishnah, number 16. So the Kesef Mishnah says what I'm about to say, but better than the Maharsha said it. The Kesef Mishnah we mentioned earlier is Rav Yosef Karo, better known as the author of the Shulchan Aruch. He writes on the Rambam. We saw him quote earlier that the Rambam's Girsha, the Rambam's text said 40 instead of 48. But here he answers the question of the Raavad. And if I'll remind you, what was the question of the Raavad? The question of the Raavad was, our Gemara says 3. So don't ignore that and quote a midrash that says 48 or 40. Stick with the Gemara that says 3. And because you didn't say he was 3, you've ignored the Gemara. That is the effect of the Raavad's question. Says the Kesef Mishnah, number 16. Ben Arbi'im Shana Hikir Avraham et Baro. Avraham was 40 when he recognized his creator. Katav Raavad Amar Avraham Yesh Agada, etc. The Raavad said what the Raavad said. The Hagahot. So the Kesef Mishnah is referring to another book called the Hagahot Maimonid. Katvu B'Shem HaRamach, who's saying something in the name of the Ramach. This is a whole chain of someone said in the name of somebody in the name of somebody. But here's the point. Line 2, middle of the line. She'efsha l'kayim zeh v'zeh. It's possible to fulfill both opinions of the Midrash. Was he 3 or was he 40? He was both. De ben shalosh shanim haya k'shehitchil lachshov. He was 3 when he began to think, uleshotet, and to wonder, b'machshavato, in his thought, both wonder with an A and wonder with an O. Lahakir baro. He began to think and to wonder and to be restless about and to recognize his creator. Aval kashahaya ben arbeim hishlim lahakiro. But when he was 40, he finished the process of recognition. So we have 2 opinions in the Midrash which are not mutually exclusive. It's not a binary choice. It's not was he 3 or was he 40. He was both. The process began when he was 3 and concluded when he was 40. For Rabbeinu katav ha'ikar shehu gamar ha'hekara. Rabbeinu, that's the Rambam, he wrote the main number, which is 40, which is when Avraham completed the process of recognizing Hashem. Dahainu kashahaya ben arbeim, which was when he was 40. So we have an answer to the question of the Raavad. The Raavad said, you're ignoring that he was 3. The Gemara says he was 3. You're going with an alternative source that gives a different answer. Says the Kesef Mishnah on behalf of the Rambam, it's not a different answer, it's the same answer. Yes, he was 3 when he started the process, and he was 40 when he ended the process. And I'm not adopting one or the other, I'm adopting both. The Rambam mentions 40 because that's the main part of the story. That's when he completed the process. But the process started when he was 3. The Rambam's not ignoring the Gemara. He's using the Gemara that says he was 3 as well as the Midrash that says he was 40. So there's no rejection of the Talmud. He is using the Talmud. He's just not totally explicit about it. But I would actually say, I think he is explicit. Because if you go back to number 3, the Rambam, who never wastes a word, opens with the following 4 words. Kevan shenigmal eitan zeh. When this spiritual giant was weaned. Why do we need to know about his feeding habits? Why is it important to say that he was weaned? The answer, I believe, and I haven't seen this inside, but maybe because I haven't looked very hard, is that's the Rambam saying when he was 3. Because I don't know exactly when weaning was, but I know it was later than it is today. I know that Avraham made a feast at the birth of Yitzchak, and the Meforshim say it was after 2 years when Yitzchak was weaned. So it fits quite well to say that Avraham was weaned when he approached 3, And the Rambam uses those words to introduce the story of Avraham because, as the Kesef Mishnah said, that's when the process began. When this giant was weaned, he began to think and to wonder about Hashem. And when he was 40, he completed the process. Which means there is a part to be played by the 3-year-old and also a part to be played by the 40-year-old. The way the Kesef Mishnah has explained the Rambam, it's not 3 or 40, it's both, because you need both. What does a 3-year-old, what does it mean that a 3-year-old child recognized Hashem? So that's the version I'm sure we've all grown up with. Maybe before, maybe we were aware of other positions as well, but 3 has always been sort of the dominant one in the story. What does it mean for a 3-year-old? Now let's assume that Avraham was not like a normal 3-year-old, which I think is the case. Let's assume that Avraham was super smart, but still a 3-year-old is a 3-year-old. So what does a 3-year-old recognizing Hashem mean? It means a 3-year-old has that wonderful sense of curiosity, that sense of wonder, that sense of excitement. And with those emotions, a 3-year-old, if they're on the level of Avraham, can begin to wonder about who's running the world. A 40-year-old has a very different approach. And the Rambam gave this whole long scientific explanation. Who's making the world go round? Avraham realizes somebody must be making the world go round. That's not a 3-year-old. A 3-year-old can't understand that. A 40-year-old has the intellectual depth, has the maturity, has the profundity, has the mature version of curiosity to reach that conclusion. And the Rambam is saying that we need the wonder and the awe of the 3-year-old, the excitement, the curiosity of the 3-year-old, and the intellectual depth of the 40-year-old. One can say that sometimes we err on one way or the other. Sometimes we focus on the emotion of the 3-year-old, and our education system doesn't develop that idea any further. There are kids going around in some of our schools, in our Jewish schools, who relate to Hashem as a 3-year-old, even when they're much, much older. Hashem is big, Hashem is powerful, and that's about it. And there are others who relate to Hashem as a 40-year-old with the intellectual depth, with the academic approach, and they miss out on the excitement and the wonder and the awe that a 3-year-old has. We need both. Now, I included here part in number 17, part of Rav Soloveitchik's book it's called Avraham's Journey, Reflections on the Life of the Founding Patriarch. I'll read it, but then I realized probably the most important part I didn't put on the page, but we'll read what he says. And by the way, Rav Soloveitchik, whose brilliance is impossible to describe, but the book which he commented most on was the Rambam. And it's very interesting and very clear that in this section that I quoted here from a much longer essay, that he is reworking the words of the Rambam into a different type of prose. But you can see clearly that he's got the Rambam open in front of him when he writes the following. How did Avraham discover God? As a young lad, when he was a shepherd, he used to spend the night in the fields. He could not sleep because he was restless. That word shotet. He particularly counted the stars. Avraham discovered God with the stars through astronomy. God communicated with Avraham constantly. The intuitive insights and sudden flashes of his mind were words the Almighty addresses to prophets. They constituted a message from the Almighty to him. Avraham discovered God all by himself. No one taught him. No one guided him. Those words came straight from the Rambam. He drew his conclusions from premises his own mind postulated. His knowledge was matured by intuitive flashes from within. Avraham had to devote some 40 years to the bold and heroic enterprise of joining the infinite. So it wasn't that something happened when he was 40. It was a 40-year process from beginning to end. Just like Rashi said in number 13, that people don't get the ability to fully understand what they've learnt until they're 40, or until they've been learning for 40 years. Number 20, man manifests his questing for God through his restlessness. That's the Rav Soloveitchik's understanding of this shotet, which from time to time results in unwarranted and unjustified nervous physical movement. In a word, a child's restlessness represents the spontaneous drive to God that every human being experiences. Avraham did succeed in converting volatile, primeval emotions into advanced knowledge. He converted this restlessness into thought. So when did Avraham have volatile, primeval emotions? When he was 3. When did Avraham have advanced knowledge? When he was 40. And the Rambam is describing the process from one to the other. He's using not just the Midrash, but the Gemara as well, that says he started when he was 3. And the Rambam adds that he finishes when he was 40. And as Rav Soloveitchik makes very clear, the process started when he was 3, but did not finish until he was 40. And the reason for that, I would suggest, is because we need both. We need the primeval emotional response of a child, and we need the intellectual depth of an advanced scientist at the age of 40. We cannot have one without the other, but between the two, we can all come to our recognition of Hashem. Thank you very much.